It can be very easy to configure access rights on web servers. That's a usability feature, making things simple. But clearly, it's also very easy to get them wrong. And one badly configured access right can cause very serious problems. Let me give you an example, and I'm going to show you another Google Doc that demonstrates it perfectly. And it's this one. We're going to look for in URL FTP. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but Google will index content over FTP. Of course, it has to be accessible to Google, and this is really the key point that I want to make here. But if it is accessible, so anonymous access is enabled, Google will index it. We're then going to look for in URL web.config, and the web.config is ASP.NET's configuration file that contains very sensitive information. And finally, we'll just make sure that we do get file types that are config. We don't want false positives, such as an open source project on GitHub. Let's now run the search. And here we go, hundreds of results for this very sensitive file. Now the story here is not so much the presence of the web.config, it's that FTP was configured to be anonymously accessible. So this is the excessive access rights message. It is excessive to allow absolutely anyone to read the contents of your website over FTP. Now this may well also include write privileges as well. If you're not aware that you've accidentally made your website anonymously accessible for people to read, you're probably also not aware that you've made it anonymously accessible to write. Now, as with the previous examples as well, this is just one Google Doc search for one specific type of file in one framework. Inevitably, the scope of the problem is much larger. There are other Google Doc searches you can perform which find all sorts of other frameworks that are also exposed over FTP. Now again, I've obfuscated these addresses for obvious reasons, but what I will say is that they even include a government department. So clearly the breadth of sites that configure their web servers with excessive access rights is very worrying. Let me give you one more example that I've seen many times myself. This is a paper from 2001, so it's clearly very old now, but it describes a very serious risk that's still prevalent today, and that's open file shares. Now this particularly happens in corporate environments, and what we're talking about here is that someone has made a file share somewhere on a server, and rather than locking that file share down to just the users who actually require it, they've left it open to everyone. Now I have seen this many times myself. I've seen very, very sensitive data exposed, and it may be behind the firewall, but of course these days we do have to work on the assumption that the network perimeter is compromised, because in large organizations it pretty much always is. Now, as this paper describes in the section about the risk, file sharing can be a major benefit. Clearly, it's advantageous to be able to share content with colleagues. But the example here is perfect. Manager of a payroll department saves a spreadsheet containing this year's pay rises, and he puts it on a hard disk and then possibly even unknowingly makes that content available via an open file share. Now anyone has access to it. And not only that, but it's easily discoverable, either just by browsing around open file shares on the network or using dedicated security tools that can automate the discovery. And this is just a perfect example of where the right is excessive. There may be some people that should have access to that file share, and indeed there are legitimate business reasons for sharing content in this fashion. But obviously, open access, even within a corporate environment, is just not acceptable. Now, the solution to both of these examples is easy, and it's this: the principle of least privilege. I've often talked about this in my Pluralsight courses because it is such a fundamental principle of information security. Only the absolute bare minimum privilege required in order to fulfill an intended function should be granted. In the FTP example, perhaps that is a single system administrator. And in the example of the open file share, there might even be a group which should have access. But clearly in both those examples, this shouldn't be a free-for-all. It shouldn't be open to absolutely everyone. That's the exact opposite of the principle of least privilege. That's giving everybody privilege, and it should not happen. So look for these examples. And of course, there are many other protocols and services which shouldn't just be open to everyone. But excessive access rights is extremely common, and it's one of the first things to look for in any system that you're involved with. Let's now move on and look at something a little bit different, and that's misconfigured SSL.